All right, welcome friends to our event, The Future of the Iran Nuclear Deal with Trita Parsi. Tonight's event is sponsored by the Middle East Working Group of Massachusetts Peace Action. Mass Peace Action is a grassroots peace organization focused on ending war and building a more peaceful society. I'd like to thank Mass Peace Action board member Sheila for arranging this event. We are joined tonight by Trita Parsi. Trita is the Executive Vice President of the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. He's an award-winning author and an expert on US-Iran relations. He is also the co-founder and former president of the National Iranian American Council, or NIAC. His latest book is called Losing an Enemy, Obama, Iran, and the Triumph of Diplomacy. Trita has lots more credentials and outstanding experience, but we won't be able to fit all of it in the hour we have tonight. So anyways, my name is Amar. I'll be your co-moderator tonight. Our other co-moderator is Christine Rostampur, a Mass Peace Action intern. Christine is from Iran. She's researched the Iran nuclear deal, and she started the No War on Iran campaign at Brandeis University. For the format of the event is 1 hour, and we have some questions for Trita, and we'll be doing some Q&A. We scheduled this event to focus on the Iran nuclear deal, and after we scheduled the event, the US went ahead and assassinated a top Iranian scientist and official. So Trita, thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
Of course. To get us started tonight, could you talk about the assassination and what it means for the Iran nuclear deal and anything else that you think is important and relevant?
Absolutely. Thank you so much. And thank you to Massachusetts Peace Action. It's always a pleasure to be with all of you. This is the first time it's done over Zoom though, but I always look forward to speaking to your group. It's always been a pleasure. Thank you so much for organizing this. I want to thank Christine, Sheila, and everyone else who's been involved in organizing it. We obviously could not know at the time when I got that first phone call from Sheila that this would be happening, but we could have predicted, and many did predict, that these next couple of weeks before Biden becomes president is going to be very, very challenging and potentially destabilizing, as it appears to be a last shot for those who have done everything they can in the last 4 years to kill the nuclear deal, make sure the US and Iran cannot have any constructive diplomacy, create maximum barriers on that road. It's their last chance to be able to inflict as much damage as possible on this. And indeed, that is what they're trying to do. Let's assess what has happened, what it means, and what it doesn't mean. Obviously, at this point, it's quite clear the Israelis were behind it. When I talk to officials, it's clear to everyone. In fact, Israeli officials have confirmed that they were behind it to the New York Times, to the Daily Beast. It's not a secret. Even their official denials have been extremely tame and benign, with not much passion or conviction behind them. So we can set aside the issue as to whether Israel was behind it or not. It's quite clear that it was. It is also quite clear that the United States was in some way, shape, or form supportive of it. We saw movements of ships and troops to the region right before this happened. These were not things that were revealed by any journalists. These were press releases that went out from Pentagon saying we're moving troops to the Middle East. We're moving B-52s to the Middle East. And then it's been revealed through reporting in a couple of newspapers that Trump himself has essentially signaled to Pompeo, who is the driving force of this within the administration, that he has even more leash than he had before, even more freedom of doing things. The red line is that apparently Trump doesn't want to have a major military confrontation, but anything short of that seems to be okay. And I think we have to keep one thing in mind. This is all happening at a time when Trump truly is not paying attention. He is entirely focused on a whole set of other issues, which has given those elements in the administration that never were in favor of diplomacy in the first place, who were trying to create a war, a maximum pressure, all of this, even more leeway and maneuverability to pursue their agenda, an agenda that at the end of the day, if it comes to its fruition, its full fruition, will be contradicting the agenda that Trump himself claims that he is pursuing. Now, was this then done to be able to set back the Iranian nuclear program, which has been the main, this surface explanation for this? When you take a look at the large number of assassinations that have taken place in the past, and Israel has conducted 6 to 8 of those in the time frame of 2007 to 2011, almost none of them took place against individuals that played critical roles in the program and as a result could decisively impact the direction of the program. Moreover, the timing of those assassinations did not take place in such a way that it actually prevented the Iranians from moving forward into a new era of its nuclear program. It was not happening at the cusp of any major nuclear breakthroughs. The assassinations tended to take place at the moment when the US and Iran were at the cusp of a diplomatic breakthrough. And this is precisely why, even under the Obama administration, these assassinations were interpreted as an effort by the Israelis to undermine diplomacy rather than really undermining the nuclear program. This is part of the reason why in 2011, if I'm not mistaken, the Obama administration itself leaked to the US media that the Israelis were behind the assassination. At one point, Hillary Clinton even took to the podium to, in person, condemn the assassination because the anger and frustration was so intense that the Israelis were doing this to undermine Obama. My conversations with people in the Biden camp have made it completely clear that not only do they view Israel as being behind it, they also view this as a deliberate effort to undermine diplomacy. In and of itself, this one attack does not appear to have that impact. It will definitely complicate matters. We have seen developments in the Iranian parliament. They're putting pressure on the administration, on the Rouhani administration, to take measures, to have a deadline for how long it can take before the Iranians will escalate some of their nuclear expansion even further, unless sanctions relief have come to Iran, meaning that the US walks back into the deal. The question is not if this one single event will have that devastating impact in terms of closing the window for diplomacy. The question is if the next couple of events that presumably will occur before Biden comes in will have that collective magnitude to be able to prevent diplomacy from taking place, or at a minimum make it so difficult for Biden that he simply may be deterred from even trying. That's where the worry is. And that's where the question then comes in. Why has the Biden administration seemingly not reacted harsher to this in order to clearly signal the Netanyahu government of how much not only Biden disapproves of it, but the consequences could be? Well, perhaps the reason I said seemingly is because we should not assume that no communication has taken place. There are signs that some communication has been taking place. Some of it actually has been public. We saw that John Brennan put out this tweet very quickly after the assassination, a very, very harsh, angry tweet in which he strongly condemned this. He called it not only terrorism, a criminal act, but he called it terrorism. He also called it state-sponsored terrorism. That's a very, very clear finger at the only state that has the capacity and the political will to do this. This may have been a signal from the Biden camp, mindful of the fact that the Biden team most likely felt that if they were to get involved in this too overtly, it could violate those norms of the United States only having one president at a time. Moreover, there may have been signals in private that may have been even more clear along these lines. What I think is interesting is that Biden himself gave an interview to Tom Friedman at the New York Times, in which he did touch upon this issue. And what came out of that interview is A, nothing has changed as a result of the assassination. Biden did not come out and add any new conditions or say, well, as a result of this, I don't know if we can move in as fast. On the contrary, he said he's looking forward to a clean compliance for compliance arrangement, which essentially means the United States goes back into compliance with the nuclear deal, meaning lifting all of the sanctions, et cetera, that have been imposed in violation of the JCPOA, and the Iranians in turn go back into their compliance. That is the easiest, fastest way of doing it. And then he talked about add-on agreements. And it's very important when the term add-on is used, it essentially means it's not a renegotiation of the JCPOA. The JCPOA stays, but on top of the JCPOA, you can then negotiate additional agreements. And those agreements could, on the one hand, address some aspects of the nuclear issue, perhaps an extension of some of the sunset clauses, as some have called them, some of the elements of the deal that expires, you can extend the timeline for it, etc. In return, of course, for more sanctions relief and other measures. But it could and also go outside of the JCPOA and include regional issues such as Syria, Yemen, Iraq, Lebanon, missiles, etc. And then he also added that in those add-on agreements, you could have the inclusion of some of the Arab states that have strictly opposed the JCPOA, but using the pretext that they were not part of it. Well, when it comes to the regional issues, they certainly should be part of the diplomacy. That also, of course, means that they have to perform diplomacy. They have to negotiate in good faith. I'm not convinced that they're ready to do so, but I believe it's critical for them to be included. And apparently that is the game plan of the Biden administration as well. One critical element here, which obviously the interview did not go into sufficient detail to reveal, but based on my understanding, most likely is the manner in which Trump will approach this, is that if the negotiations on the add-ons fail, it does not affect the JCPOA. The future of the JCPOA is not dependent upon the success of the add-on agreements in terms of negotiating them. They may not be able to come to an agreement on those issues, but that doesn't mean that the JCPOA baseline would be upended if they fail. On the contrary, it will stay there. It will be a foundation that is solid, will remain in place regardless, but hopefully they will succeed in negotiating additional add-on agreements that addresses other issues or may also address some issues within the JCPOA. But that also, for instance, means that if they fail to come to an agreement on how to extend the restrictions on some of these elements from 5 to 15 years, for instance, just because they fail to do so doesn't mean that the JCPOA then collapses and everything is lost. And this is really essential, because if it's not interpreted this way, then it essentially means that they're renegotiating the JCPOA. And that is something that not only Iranians, but also the Europeans and others have made quite clear is not really on the table. The element of all of this that I think has been the least attended to in the US media and in the conversation is not so much whether Trump was in on it or not. I think it's quite clear that he was. It's that this is a rather peculiar behavior, even for the standards of Netanyahu. Under normal circumstances, countries right now are paying very little attention to what Trump or whichever outgoing president there is, and is turning their focus to what are the preferences, the ideas, the goals, and the likely policies of the next administration. And they do everything they can to put themselves in the best possible footing with the next administration and the next president. Here you have Netanyahu do quite the opposite. He is not only disregarding the preferences, the stated and explicit preferences of the incoming president, he is directly and deliberately undermining that preference and undermining the strategy that Biden has said that he wants to pursue. And I said even for Netanyahu standards, that is quite shocking. Because when you take a look at the history of Obama and Netanyahu's relationship, they had a famously bad relationship. Netanyahu, incidentally, has had a famously bad relationship with almost all American presidents. It may not have started that way, but it's always ended that way. But in the case of Netanyahu and Obama, it started on a very, very bad footing. Their first meeting in May 2009 at the White House was quite a disaster. But it was a disaster not by design. It did not appear as if either side actually intended to throw the first blow. What happened was a series of miscalculations and misunderstandings. Obama raised the issue of a settlement freeze, which Netanyahu took as Obama pulling the rug under his feet because such a big request apparently needed to have been cleared before it would ever be brought up in a direct conversation between the two of them. So he was taken aback and surprised by it and felt that he was knifed in the back. That was not how it was intended. At the same time, he paid back rather quickly because at that very press conference that day, he put words in Obama's mouth, claiming that in their private conversation, Obama had said things about his Iran strategy that Obama probably didn't say, and even if he did it, he did not want it to be public. Netanyahu wanted it to be public because he knew that if those statements were made public, it would make diplomacy more difficult. And both sides walked away from that meeting extremely frustrated and angry at each other, particularly that moment when Netanyahu in front of Obama essentially says, "Thank you for saying this in our private conversation." And there was no agreement that those elements of that conversation would be made public. But at the end of the day, it was a series of miscalculations and misunderstandings. What you have here with Netanyahu going forward with an assassination directly and deliberately aimed at undermining Biden is quite different. It means that Netanyahu has taken off his gloves and he is throwing the first punch even before Biden even has had a chance to swear the oath or even write his inaugural address. That is quite shocking, I have to say. I do not know how the Biden team has interpreted this, whether this reinforces their belief that they actually have to find some sort of a solution that makes Netanyahu happy, which I do not believe is possible. I do not believe there's any solution that entails improved US-Iran relations that Netanyahu would be content with. Or whether it reinforces their belief that in order to get this done, they have to give up the illusion that you actually can please all of these different actors at the same time, and instead put clear US national security at the center of their strategy. And if that means there needs to be some form of an agreement with Iran on the nuclear front, perhaps another agreement on regional issues, that needs to be pursued in order to protect the United States. And do everything you can to make sure that this is also good for the other states in the region, of course, but not necessarily pleasing every single political leader whose political ambitions and orientations may simply be impossible to please. Moreover, it raises questions as to whether this administration, the Biden administration, believes that you can have a nuclear deal that is durable if it continues to exist solely within a context in which the United States and Iran remain bitter enemies. I think one of the conclusions of the last 4 years, not just here, but also in Tehran, needs to be that if you actually want to see the nuclear deal survive, you need to create an infrastructure of diplomatic activity and systems and mechanisms around it in order to protect it and insulate it from external shocks, including negative developments in their relationships on other issues. That did not exist. In my view, it means that the United States and Iran, if they truly want to keep the nuclear deal, they have to go for a much better relationship between the two countries, because the idea that the nuclear deal can survive and endure while the two countries are at each other's throats is essentially proven false. The fact that this time around, the Iranians kept themselves into the deal and did not walk out should not be an indication that that will happen every time either the US or the Iranians try to pull out of the deal. We need to have mechanisms and buffers that ensures that this deal can survive and will not be the victim of every political wind that blows in Tehran, in Riyadh, in Tel Aviv, or in Washington. This, I think, is probably the biggest failure of the previous team, of the Obama team and the Iranians, because they had an exaggerated view of how institutionalized this deal was. Even though they had clear warnings, remember, Senator Tom Cotton wrote a letter to the Supreme Leader of Iran in the midst of the negotiations, promising him, don't trust the President of the United States because we who oppose the deal will undo the deal as soon as Obama is out of office. Those of us who was working on this issue at the time, we did kind of laugh at this. We thought it was a completely inappropriate thing, something that actually undermined the US negotiating position, but we did not see it as being a credible threat. It was. And the question is, what will the United States and Iran do if they do manage to go back to the JCPOA to ensure that this cannot happen again? I'll stop there and be happy to take your questions.
Thanks, Trita. And I misspoke in the beginning saying that the U.S. did the assassination. So thanks for correcting that. Next up, I'd like to pass the floor to Christine.
Thank you everyone for joining this timely event. Thank you, Mr. Parsi, for giving us some of your time despite your busy schedule. I think the plan that you planned out for Iran and the US is actually what seems to be the most rational approach. Unfortunately, that's not always how things pan out in the real world, especially because this time around, a lot of those connections that were made in the past are lost. A lot of the back channels are lost. There's a new administration. Right now, there's no diplomatic, I would say, relationship as of now. My question for you is, in this situation, and also especially given that the US seems to be saying that Iran should take the next step, Iran should lower its enrichment activities before the US removes the sanctions. In such a situation, how do you assess the Biden team's ability to approach this issue? And what advice do you have for them given the current conditions? Thank you.
Thank you so much for that question. I think there is a degree of impreciseness right now in some of the public statements. They're not explicitly, I mean, the way they come across is exactly the way you interpret it. It sounds as if Iran has to take the first step. I think both sides know quite well that this is going to be a mutual process in which both of them will more or less act at the same time. Where it gets a little bit trickier is that the process for the Iranians to reverse some of the decisions, some of the things that they have done that are not compatible with the JCPOA. I mean, they've reduced some of their commitments to the JCPOA, is a relatively easy process. It can be reversed fast. It won't take much time. The process of lifting sanctions that Trump has imposed is a different story. The US is actually not quite good at lifting sanctions in the first place. And we saw that in the last round of the JCPOA, that the sanctions relief process is actually not working very well. In addition to that, Trump also imposed a whole set of new sanctions. Sanctions that were not a reimposition of sanctions. And many of those were imposed on grounds that were not related to the nuclear issue, deliberately in order to make sure that the US would not be obligated to lift them if there was a JCPOA return. Most likely, the US will have to lift those sanctions as well, and most likely the US will agree to do at least most of those. Because if it doesn't, the sanctions relief is really meaningless. The same sanction that was imposed on this nuclear ground has now been imposed on human rights or ballistic missile grounds. Well, if you lift it on the nuclear grounds, it doesn't matter because they still exist. So the Iranians are not getting any economic benefit. So I think the Biden team, fully understands that part of it. It's just the timing of them being able to effectively lift it is more complicated than it is for the Iranians to reverse some of their nuclear decisions. My impression is, though, that the real stumbling blocks may not be here, that they, through track 2 and other kinds of informal conversations, have been able to figure this out relatively well. The question is what happens afterwards, in the sense that last time around, the intent was to make sure that they would move on to other issues. Zarif himself said several times that the JCPOA is just the floor, it's not the ceiling. The question was, of course, that the Iranians did not want to move fast because they wanted to make sure that the US was implementing its end of the bargain first, and that it was proving itself to be trustworthy before the Iranians were willing to go to other issues. The US side was also really not much in a rush, for the same reason, but in reverse, but also because it was massive Iran fatigue at the White House by the time the nuclear deal was struck and by the time the nuclear deal passed Congress. And there were so many issues that had been neglected, and there was just an eagerness to go and attend to those issues rather than to then take it to the next level. It appears that the Biden administration has learned from that lesson, and as a result, want to move quickly. And I think that is, to a large extent, the correct move, to move quickly to other negotiations, and do so before momentum is lost. And there, I think it's going to be quite a bit trickier. On the one hand, you do need to include the Saudis and the UAE, but up until this point, their assessment of wanting to be included in the diplomacy has not been in order to make sure that a better deal is found. It's been to make sure that no deal is found. The same is true for Netanyahu. Now, perhaps they will shift their attitude when it comes to regional issues. I mean, if the Biden team really is very firm and say, we're going to talk about these things, we're going to address these issues, and you need to be there, I think their preferences and their strategies may adjust accordingly. But I think it's really important to keep one thing in mind if that negotiation is to be successful. That negotiation cannot just be about Iran's support for proxies, Iran's involvement in Syria, and Iranian ballistic missile. It will have to include Saudi ballistic missiles, F-35s, and a gazillion dollars of weaponry that the US is selling to the UAE and Saudi Arabia. Saudi support for all kinds of crazy proxy groups throughout the Middle East. It's not just the Iranians that are engaged with proxies, etc. They're just better at it and more effective at it than the others. But everyone is doing this in the Middle East, unfortunately. Just take a look at everywhere the tiny UAE is involved. They're involved in almost every conflict in the region. Most of the time battling Turkey, not Iran. So there's a lot of other things that need to be on the agenda, and it's not clear to me to what extent some of these countries are actually willing to bargain on those issues. And it's also very unclear to me if the United States is ready and willing, it should be, but is it ready and willing to stop selling billions of dollars of weaponry to these countries in the Persian Gulf? That may actually prove to be the biggest stumbling block in such a negotiation. But I think moving in that direction, nevertheless, is a good thing. I think pressure from groups such as yours and others in favor of a swift return to the JCPOA towards a solid negotiation afterwards that is an add-on, that is not going to come, that is separated from the JCPOA, is also going to be critical. And a lot of that involvement has to be in Congress, because some of the challenges to successes in these areas is going to be in Congress, particularly in the Senate, if the Republicans retain control over the Senate.
You talked about the implications of not returning to the Iran deal. I also wanted you to perhaps comment on the window of opportunity that the Biden team has, and what happens if they do not return swiftly to the deal. What would be the impact of that on Iran's domestic affairs if any, especially given that Iran's presidential elections are also coming up?
Yeah, it's an excellent point, Christine, because the Iranian elections are in mid-June 2021. Biden becomes president in mid-January or late January. And he's going to need some time to just collect his team. I think they're moving very fast on that, knowing very well that they're not going to have the regular honeymoon that most presidents tend to get. He's also going to have to attend to a very large number of crises, domestic and international, that will compete for his attention. And on top of that, then you have a very short window on the Iranian side. I think the game plan is to do a quick return to the JCPOA to ensure that the JCPOA is there and it's relatively safe. So whatever yet happens in the Iranian elections will not affect the decision whether to go back to the JCPOA or not. And I think this is also should be done from a strictly safe perspective from the US side, because if it so turns out that the US is back in the deal and the Iranians end up electing a president who pulls the Iranians out of the deal, well, then the fault will be that of the Iranians, because the US is back in the deal, but now the Iranians are doing something that is problematic. If the JCPOA has not been returned to and the Iranians have a presidential elections and they elect a president who walks out of the deal, well, even so, it's an Iranian walk out of the deal 3 years after the US walked out. So it's still the fault of the US for having done this in the first place. So I think the Biden team should have a strong sense that timing, it's actually more important for the US side to get this done quickly than the Iranian side. We should also be quite ready that there's a significant likelihood, although one should never predict Iranian elections this long ahead, but there's a significant likelihood that the Iranians will end up electing a conservative president who, much like the conservative president on the US side in 2016, will run on a platform opposing not only the JCPOA, but engagement with the US as a whole. If that were to be the case, it's definitely going to complicate matters tremendously. And it's going to complicate matters even more so if the JCPOA has not been returned to Biden. Again, another very important reason for the US to make sure that the re-entry is done as quickly as possible. I know that someone in the chat raised the issue of compensation. The Iranians have made public statement that they want compensation for the significant cost they have paid for the US's violations. It is my impression that to a certain extent that is more of a bargaining tool, and that they don't have any realistic expectations that there would be a compensation from the United States. But it will probably be something that they will continue to use for as a bargaining chip in the add-on agreements and negotiations. I think the Iranians themselves realize, however justified that claim may be, insisting on it is going to ensure that nothing happens at all, and that would be a very negative situation for the Iranians. And I think also, to a certain extent, the Iranians have been raising that issue because there have been some people in the Biden camp who have said that they should use the existing sanctions, Trump sanctions, as a bargaining chip, which I think is an extremely unfortunate thing to say, because it essentially means that Biden's policy is no different from that of Trump's policy. He may not impose the sanctions, but he's not willing to lift them unless there's a renegotiation, which is exactly what Trump said that he would do. So if that's the message sent to the Iranians will either start making claims such as this, or they will actually start expanding their nuclear program to have their own leverage to bargain away.
Thanks, Trita. Just to pivot real quickly away from the JCPOA, and we could come back to it. But I remember when the US did assassinate Iranian General Soleimani, I think I heard you say, and correct me if I'm misinterpreting your analysis at the time, but I think what you said at the time was that the first thing Iran did after that assassination was they went to China and Russia and asked them basically, what should we do? and China and Russia responded, hey, do something, do some response, but don't kill any Americans. It seems to me like that's what happened. So the question for you is, you know, a lot of people in the peace movement are concerned about a new Cold War with America and Russia and China. Are you concerned about that? And if so, is Iran a potential flashpoint for a new Cold War or a proxy war?
Thank you. I am extremely concerned about a Cold War with China, not only because it's unnecessary, that there are definitely problems between the United States and China, many of them, and many of them are very serious. None of them, however, really justify this degree of securitization of those issues. Some of them are just economic competition issues. They can be dealt with as such rather than going towards a Cold War. The real danger with the Cold War here is that if Cold War with China ends up becoming the organizing principle of American foreign policy, then you are going to see the militarization of almost all other issues. You're going to see an increase of the Pentagon budgets. You're going to see that there's not going to be any realistic thing done on climate change because we're not going to be able to have any progress on climate change while the US and China are entangled in a security competition. You're going to see the Middle East suddenly be seen from the prism of US-China competition. So suddenly, you know, right now, most of Washington agreed the Middle East has lost strategic importance. It is not as strategically vital to the United States in any way, shape, or form compared to what it was perhaps 40 or so years ago. If you have a Cold War with China, suddenly control of the Middle East becomes a competition between China and the United States, and suddenly will become very important again. So the way I see it is that the hawks in Washington have kind of figured out, instead of losing ground on many of these issues, if they want to continue the war in Yemen, they're seeing that the political winds are going against them. They want to have a hawkish position on Iran. The political winds are going against them. You get your Cold War with China, the political winds are going to be all in their favor on almost every issue. I think it's going to be tremendously disastrous. And as a result, I am very concerned about it. And I think it's very important, not just for peace groups, because I think the peace groups would get it very quickly, but that the message is spread on to environmentalist groups and others that as critical as this is, you know, battling climate change, I mean, it is the existential threat of our era. We're not going to be able even to get to that if we, at the same time, pursue such a militaristic foreign policy in which we choose to have a Cold War with China. There's nothing that is actually driving us in this direction that would justify such a framework for the US-China relationship.
Thanks. Yeah, climate change, we need to work with China on, and also pandemic disease as well. That's another thing. All right, so next up we have a question from a Mass Peace Action board member and member of Mass Peace Action Working Group, Valentine. She's also a professor of sociology at Northeastern. Val, are you on?
I just had to unmute myself. Yes, I am on. Nice to see everyone. Dr. Parsi, very nice to see you again. Badarud, as we say. Thank you very much for that excellent presentation and clarification of what are really very complex as well as very unfortunate issues. You know, the recent assassination of a top Iranian official by Israel, and of course the one back in January of General Soleimani by the United States. These are, of course, blatant violations of international law, and really they demonstrate a breathtaking disregard for international law and really widespread lawlessness, frankly. So I have less confidence in you know in the U.S. government to be able to move the country in the direction either of an attenuation of Trump's Cold War or peace with Iran. But there has not been widespread condemnation of these acts here in the United States. And I have found that quite puzzling, although the other thing that I have found very puzzling, and maybe this part isn't really a question for you, is that the American political system is such that it delegates so much power to the executive branch that a president can come in and simply poof, abrogate, a treaty or an agreement that the previous president has made. I've never been able to wrap my head around that sort of executive power. So it seems to me that the only way to end this type of arbitrary unilateral actions, not to mention violations of international law, and of course the sanctions, is not so much to put all our eggs in the American basket, but really to focus on some kind of international pressure. And so my question comes in two parts. Why do you think we are not seeing any moves internationally, say at the level of the General Assembly or the Security Council, to condemn these acts? I did see a recent statement by, I don't know, the deputy spokesperson or something like that of the Secretary General, and it was very, very wishy-washy. You might have seen it yourself. And secondly, why do we not see any international mobilization? That is to say, groups coming together, international NGOs, social movement organizations, civil society organizations, progressive political parties, similar to what happened in the run-up to the Bush regime's attack on Iraq in 2003. So why do you think this is not happening, whether at the intergovernmental level or at the level of civil society? Are you aware of any kind of international initiatives, pressures, efforts going on? And do you think they might make a difference after all? Yeah, I think that's it.
Thank you so much. So great seeing you as well. On to the first question, I think we have to recognize in the last 20 years, ever since Bush went to war in Iraq, international institutions, the UN in particular, has significantly lost influence and relevance, frankly, in the international arena. It is an extremely negative but appreciated point. It may have gone so slowly that we haven't noticed it, but in the past, if you had, for instance, the assassination of Soleimani, which brought us this close to full-scale war. I mean, in fact, we were lucky. According to military officials here in the US that I've spoken to, they completely challenged the narrative that the Iranians deliberately shot the missiles in such a way and such a timing in order to avoid casualties. They were actually trying to get Americans killed in retaliation, and by pure luck, no Americans died. So we were truly very, very close to full war. 20 years ago, what would have happened would be that the UN Secretary General would quickly jump on an airplane, fly to Tehran, fly to Washington, fly to Baghdad, and try to mediate. That was his or her job to do. Today, no one even asks. In fact, I can't even remember the name of the UN Secretary General right now. That's how irrelevant it's become. Which then means that the type of mediation and effort to try to de-escalate and resolve tensions falls onto political leaders in countries that have that very uncommon combination of, on the one hand, having the political will and having the political opportunity internally to do so. And that's quite uncommon in the sense that even if they have the political will, if they have too many crises at home, if this is going to be seen as risky and create domestic political problems for it, they're just going to walk away. So we don't have those kind of deconflicting mechanism and de-escalation mechanism as we did before, because no one is taking the UN seriously anymore. It's been so weakened. And this was a deliberate strategy by the neoconservatives, who viewed these international institutions and norms as primarily establishing restraints on American power. And they wanted to destroy them in order to make sure that US power would be unrestrained. Remember, people like John Bolton were very angry about Bush going to the UN and calling for a vote and making his case there in the Security Council, because it essentially meant that the UN is important. The argument was actually completely ignore it. That will not only get rid of Saddam, but it will get rid of the UN as well, which is what we want. Incidentally, this past summer, when the US tried to go to the Security Council and ask for a snapback of sanctions on Iran, Bolton opposed it. Not because he didn't want to snap back the sanctions, but he said, why are we giving the UN legitimacy again? They want to get rid of everything that can constrain the United States from having a completely unconstrained maneuverability. And that is my best answer as to why we have this. And to reverse it, we need to reverse what the neoconservatives have done. Pursuing a foreign policy in which the United States, and this is not just the neoconservatives, they're the harsher wing of a broader Washington consensus that the United States needs to have a grand strategy in the world that necessitates for the US to be the military hegemon, to be militarily dominating essentially every corner of this planet. Global military hegemony ultimately is the grand strategy of the United States. That is why we have 860 military bases around the world. The country that has the second largest number of bases is France and Russia. They have 11 each. We have 860. That is how massive that discrepancy is. But if you pursue that, then you have the maneuverability to do things that no other country can do. There's only one country that actually designs its military to be able to travel 2 oceans and do a land invasion on the other side of the planet. There is no other country on this planet that designs its military to have that type of capability. If we have that and we pursue that and we put that as center of our foreign policy, yes, then we're going to see all of these international institutions as things that will constrain us from doing things that many of us would still recognize are completely stupid and unstrategic. But we don't even want to have that constraint to be able to do things that are unstrategic.
Thanks, Trita. You speak about this Washington consensus about American hegemony, not just among war hawks, but generally Democrats, the establishment. How do we break that Washington consensus?
Great question, and it gives me a chance to plug my new institute that I've been helping set up in the last 2 years, which is the Quincy Institute. We're the only think tank, transpartisan think tank at least in Washington, that explicitly are pursuing a different grand strategy, and we are questioning what is otherwise known as liberal hegemony or primacy. We are favoring a strategy that otherwise is known as restraint. We call it responsible statecraft. Some of the leading figures of it are in your town, Steve Walt, Barry Posen, which essentially means that the United States does not need, for its security, to dominate these different parts of the globe. In most of these different parts of the globe, the United States does not have that interest. In the Middle East, we put out a paper. Our argument is, yes, it would be negative for the United States if someone else, a hostile power, retained hegemony there. There is no such candidate. All the United States needs to do is to have the ability to prevent a hostile power to have hegemony there. It does not need to have a hegemony of its own. So as a result, it does not need to have this massive military presence in the Middle East. We can actually be much safer by not pursuing primacy. Primacy actually has made us more unsafe, not just in terms of the manner in which it antagonizes countries and brings us into endless war, but also because it is putting our focus on all the wrong threats. We are experiencing a 9/11 in this country every 3 days as a result of the pandemic. $800 billion to the Pentagon a year has done nothing to protect us from something that already now is 100 times worse than 9/11 was. So our focus is on the wrong things, and where we do focus, we tend to make matters worse. So we need a fundamental review and rethinking of our foreign policy. Our hope is that the pandemic, combined with 20 years of endless war, will bring about enough political will to do so. And we are trying to create some of that political mobilization, that pressure on Congress, on the executive branch to pursue that. And we think groups like yours are going to be instrumental in helping and also helping driving this. Because I think part of the reason I moved from NIAC and helped set up QI is actually precisely the experience of the JCPOA, in which we worked 15 years to get that deal. But because that deal contradicted US grand strategy, US grand strategy of dominating does not in any way, shape, or form give space for the United States to make a compromise with a middle power like Iran. To have multilateral diplomacy that actually brings about a compromise is not really permitted within that paradigm. Having 50 more years of endless war in Afghanistan with no purpose is completely compatible with that grand strategy. The thinking there was that if the JCPOA, if it collapsed as a result of it being within a grand strategy that could not sustain it, that could not support it, then I did not have the energy to fight another 15 years and potentially winning another battle and then seeing it evaporate in front of our eyes within 2 years. We actually needed to change the grand strategy in order to turn the tables. Instead of having the war hawks always having the cards stacked in their favor, we need peace to be stacked in our favor. We need those who are pushing for these solutions to have a structure of US foreign policy that is biased in their favor rather than biased against them. And I think the momentum for having that type of a big shift is there. We have to capitalize on it.
Thank you. And yeah, no, the work you guys do at the Quincy Institute is great. It fuels our work that we do here and others in the peace movement as well. So next up, and it's looking like this will be our last question of the night, I will pass the floor over to Brian Garvey.
Thanks, Amar, and thanks, Dr. Parsi, for being with us. You mentioned earlier the importance of Congress in all of this. At Peace Action, we like to stress the action part of our name, and I think there's a lot of people on this call who really want to do something to ensure that we don't start another catastrophic war in the Middle East, and that we take steps towards rejoining the JCPOA and towards a lasting peace with Iran. What is some advice that you could give to the individuals on this meeting right now and to peace organizations? What's the best way to influence members of Congress in your experience? What's a message that gets through to them? Yeah, please, we would appreciate your advice.
I think it's an excellent question. Every seminar should end with something that really looks at some concrete things that your members can focus on. I think you are likely going to see some efforts in the next couple of weeks in the new Congress, potentially a resolution that will call for the US to return to the JCPOA. It will probably reflect the language in the Democratic platform, the call for a clean reentry to the JCPOA. And it will be a way to build political support and create political space, but also some political pressure on the Biden camp to move fast and swiftly back into the JCPOA. It may also come in other forms. It could be a letter, it could be other things, but it will provide a target for groups like yours. Start calling your members of Congress, all of them in Massachusetts, to make sure that they are on that letter, that they are putting their signature or that they're co-sponsoring that resolution or voting for that resolution, because it will be a very clear and important signal to the Biden administration about the political space and the political demand that exists in Congress for there to be a clean JCPOA reentry. And then after that, hopefully there will be other ways and other instruments that your energy can be focused on and challenged through to create space for the add-on agreements, etc. But first step first on the JCPOA. And I think that's going to be very, very important because something really dramatic has happened here. The democratic grassroots is a big reason as to why the JCPOA has more support now than it did in 2015. It's partly because of groups like yours. It's partly because people have seen that the JCPOA works. They have seen that the Iranians actually lived up to it. So some of the question marks that existed, some of the Democrats who were against it in 2015 have now come in favor of it. That needs to, I'm not entirely sure that people in the Biden administration fully appreciate this, because they may still be under the impression that Congress is this hostile territory, that it's anti the JCPOA. I don't believe it is. The Senate might be a little bit different, and we'll see how the elections go. But I think there's far more support there than most people appreciate, and it would be good to even expand that further. The other thing that I think is important, I think there needs to be some political pressure on Democratic lawmakers, Senate and House, that there cannot be any tolerance of other countries, particularly strategic partners of the United States, so blatantly, so aggressively, and so deliberately working to undermine US national security and undermine the options and the maneuverability of future presidents or existing presidents. I mean, what has been done here in deliberate way to undermine Biden and to box him in cannot be acceptable, should not go unpunished. There needs to be some political consequences for this. And I think they need to feel the heat from the grassroots of saying, what are you doing? I mean, earlier on, the question was, why aren't we hearing more condemnations? Perhaps there should be political pressure on these lawmakers. Have you spoken out on this issue? Have you said something? Are you okay with this happening? Not just because it's a murder and assassination, all of those things, but also because it's actually deliberately aimed at undermining the next president of the United States. So I think there's a lot of targets that you can have, a lot of campaigns that you can organize and put pressure. And I think particularly on the Senate side, it may be even more important. And this is actually one of the good news. I want to end up with some piece of good news. We are going back into an era now where there will be some degree of normalcy. It may not be the normalcy we like, but normalcy in the sense that there actually will be a policy process. As long as there's a policy process, there's also place and space for a group like yours, because you can influence that process. For the last 4 years, there's not been a process. It's been some form of a banana republic. Who knows how the decisions have been made? And if you don't know how the decisions are made, how can you influence them? How can a grassroots organization have an impact? We're at least now going back to a sense of normalcy in which there will be a process. There will be somewhat of a chaotic process, but nevertheless, you will be able to figure out where the right pressure points are. And that's a big difference.
Yes, thank you. Great points. I'd just like to note that Brian shared a link in the chat. If people click on that link, it will send a message to their members of Congress and our senators about returning to diplomacy with Iran, a no war with Iran. So please do click that link. I'm going to give the floor to Brian for our closing remarks. So from my end, I'd just like to say thank you to everyone for joining us tonight and for being interested in this issue and for working towards peace. Thank you to Mr. Trita Parsi for joining us and sharing your thoughts and insights with us. Trita, actually, last question of the night. Isn't Sheila awesome? Thank you to Sheila for organizing this, this incredible event. And Brian, please close us off for the night.
Sure. Thank you so much, Amar, Chris, Dr. Parsi, for a fantastic program, and for everyone who joined us. As I said earlier, we like to stress the action in peace action. So please, everyone do click the link that I'm putting in the chat right now. We will send it to you in a follow-up email. Our members of Congress need to feel the pressure on this issue. Poll after poll, a lot of good work done by the Quincy Institute is showing us that the American people are sick and tired of endless war. But their views are not represented well enough by our government. So we need to make our voices loud and clear, and let your politicians know that you are going to hold them accountable. We will not stand another war in the Middle East. We want peace with Iran. We want our troops to come home. We want the money that we spend on endless wars to come home and protect us against the real threats to this country, like COVID-19 and like climate change. So I want to thank everyone once again, and a special thanks to Sheila for organizing this, and to Dr. Parsi. And remember, hold your politicians accountable. Don't let them off the hook. Make a demand, because that's the only way that things change. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Have a good night. Be safe.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Peace, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.